Can you all hear me? So I'm going to take this microphone and talk from the center of the stage. So first of all, Danny, thank you very much for the warm welcome. And as somebody who lives in Toronto, Canada, and spends an awful lot of time in America, I often feel lonely because America is a very different place than Canada, both as a country and certainly within the Jewish community. So I'm really fortunate to be so far away from home, yet being here these last couple of days, I really feel at home, because this Jewish community and the Jewish community of Canada have a lot of similarities and a lot in common. So thank you very much for making me feel welcome. I hope too that you will be able to decipher and understand my thick Canadian accent. I will try to tone it down for you a little bit. We have one Canadian fan in the audience. Thankfully, Danny introduced me, and that honor didn't fall on my father, who's not here. He's home in Toronto, because if my father was here, he would introduce me very differently. He would introduce me as, this is my son, Michael, who's trained as both a lawyer and a teacher, yet chooses to do neither. And that is where his introduction of me would end, because I'm pretty certain that my father has no idea what I do for a living. In fact, I've heard him describe me to his friends as, well, he's involved in education, but not real education that takes place in a classroom. That education that takes place on trips and youth movements and summer camps. So if I seem to have a bit of an identity crisis, you will understand why. And I've spent much of my adult life trying to sort of answer important questions, such as the one I'm going to address today, which is, why be Jewish and why be a part of a Jewish community? So with this identity crisis intact, I was always at a loss. I would meet my high school mates at a reunion, and everybody would ask what we did for a living, and this guy was a doctor, and this guy was a lawyer, and by the time it came to me, it took me 30 minutes to explain to them what I actually did for a living. And nowhere was that more evident than when I would cross over into America, and I would get some overzealous customs agent who would ask me, what do you do for a living, sir? And I would say, I work for a not-for-profit organization, hoping that would suffice. It never did. They would ask, doing what? And I said, well, I'm involved in educational travel. And they says, well, what does that mean? I said, well, what it means is we maximize the number of teenagers, young adults who travel to Eastern Europe and Israel to really connect with the land and the people of Israel and build strong Jewish communities when they come home. To which they would usually respond, so you're a travel agent. To which I would respond, if that will get me into America, I will be whatever you want me to be. And the answer really came to me in June of 2001. For those of you who remember what was going on in the world, in particular the Jewish world, the second Intifada was raging. There were suicide bombings taking place on a daily basis all over Israel, and it was a time of great terror, not only for Israelis, but for Jews around the world. It was also the second year of a program called Birthright Israel. And at the time, I was running the Birthright Israel programs in Canada, and we were scheduled to, we had chartered an LL 747, 440 Birthright participants. And 4 days before that trip was to go, there was that terrible bombing at the Dolphinarium in Tel Aviv. We all remember 23 people were killed, 72 people injured, some of them quite significantly, and it sent shockwaves throughout Israel and the Jewish world, because these were teenagers, these were kids, these were non-combatants who just found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time, and it was horribly tragic. And of course, the Jewish community in Canada raged into a debate, should we still send these trips, should we didn't? I remember sitting around the boardroom table, half of the room over here said, if we don't send these trips, terrorism wins. And the other half of the room said, we understand that, but should we be sending our young people into a dangerous situation? So they asked me the question. They said, tell me, can you still provide a safe and meaningful experience? And the answer to the question was yes, we could. It would be different than the traditional Israel Experience programs. We would spend more time in the periphery, less time in the center of the country, in the major areas, Ben Yehuda Street and the Tayelet. We would up our security, but yes, we could provide. And the decision was made that we would go ahead with the programs, and anyone who wanted to withdraw with no penalty could absolutely do that. And in the end, 4 days later, 75%, 330 of the people showed up. Now that evening, I was scheduled to do an orientation for the participants, and of course, they brought all their parents, to go over the orientation and safety and security, and prayed that no one would ask me the following question, which was, are you going on the trip? Because the answer was no. I had just come back. It wasn't my turn to go. And I realized that I could not in good conscience stand in front of a room full of people and say, it's safe for you all to go to Israel, but I'm going to stay right here. Not that I'm any great extra measure of security. And fortuitously, earlier that day, one of my staff came to me and she said, I cannot staff this trip. She said, the pushback I'm getting from my parents and my family is too much. I will cause irreparable damage to my family if I go on this trip. I have to withdraw. So I used that opportunity to insert myself in her role, and now I was going on the trip, and I could stand in front of these people and say, we are going to Israel together. Again, not that I provided any extra measure of security, but from a leadership standpoint, I felt it was the right thing to do. My employer was okay with my decision. There was one person, however, who I knew would not be okay with my decision. And that would be, here's the audience participation part, you see, everyone says my wife. Not my wife, for two reasons. One, I am not scared of my wife. Don't ever tell her I said that. And two, I wasn't married at the time. So the second answer was my mother, of course. So here's some advice that you may not know. If you ever have to make a call that you really don't want to make it on your cell phone and make it in an area that has notoriously bad reception. I'll replay for you that call. Hi, Mom, how are you? She said, I'm fine. What do you want? I said, I don't want anything. I just called to see how you are. She said, no, you didn't. You never call me to see how I am. You call me when you want something. So what is it that you want? So I said, well, I wanted to tell you that I'm going away. She said, no, you didn't. You never tell me when you're going away. I never know where you are. Why all of a sudden now are you telling me when you're going away? And where, by the way, are you going? Now, at this point, I was going to lie. I was going to say, I'm going to LA. I would have called her, all the time, but I can't lie to my mother. So I said, I'm going to, and I mumbled it. I said, I'm going to Israel. And she said, to where? And I said, to Israel. And she said, oh, I heard you. She said, the pause was merely for dramatic effect. So she said, can't somebody else go to Israel? And I said, well, they could, but it's kind of my job. And she said, I don't understand why you have to go. I said, Mom, back to the job thing. I've moved out of your house. You no longer support me. I have a job. If I don't go to Israel, I'm going to have to move back in. And then my mother did something that no Jewish mother has ever done before. She used this technique, you may have heard of it, it's called Jewish guilt. Do they have that down here? And this is what she said to me. She said, when you're in Israel, I don't sleep. So I was like, okay, it's 10 days, there's good stuff on television, she'll survive. She said, I don't eat. I said, will you drink water? She said, yeah. I said, okay, you'll be fine. She said, I watch CNN hoping to see you walking around alive. And I realized there's no way I'm winning this debate. So the one thing I learned from law school was, how to reframe and validate. So I validated her concern. I said, Mom, you have every right to be upset. She says, yes. And I said, the problem is the person you should be upset with is not me. She said, so who should I be upset with? I said, you should be upset with that terrible, awful, evil man that you sleep with every night. That's my dad, by the way. And she said, what do you mean? I said, what do you mean? I said, in 1967, when I was 1 and my brother was 3, and war breaks out in Israel, my father, your husband, volunteered to fight in the IDF. He booked himself a ticket on El Al to go and volunteer for the IDF. Now, the next day his brother canceled the ticket, said he was crazy. My father rebooked it the next day, his brother canceled it the next day. This went on for 6 days, and by that time the war was over, so he never actually went. But the story is legendary. I said, this is the same man who made me have my bar mitzvah at the Kotel Yerushalayim. This is the same man who, when I was 12, sent me to a Zionist summer camp. I stayed for 22 years. This was the same man who, when I was 18 in my senior year, pulled me out of high school and made me live in Israel with him when he went on sabbatical, because that was what young Jews did. I said, you want to blame someone for my bizarre connection to Israel? I said, you blame him. And she said, you're right, and she hung up the phone. And I'm patting myself on the back saying, dude, you're a genius. I got not 4 more blocks away, and my phone rings, and this time not my mom, it was my dad. And my level of fear goes something like this: Hashem, my dad, and then my mom. And he says, I don't know what you just said to your mother, but she called me out of a meeting, said I was the worst person in the world. I'm sleeping in the garage for at least the next 10 days, and quite possibly for the rest of my life. And it was then that I finally understood. You see, I remember when I was 13 years old, standing on the Mount of Olives with my father and my mother and my brother and my sister, and my father showed us Jerusalem. And he said, this is the eternal capital of Israel. And he said, I sincerely hope that you will develop a meaningful connection with the land and the people of Israel like I have. You see, my father was orphaned by the time he was 17. And shortly after losing his parents, he moved to Israel and spent a year there working on a kibbutz and studying hadracha. And Israel, de facto, became the community that helped heal him during this difficult time. And so strong was his connection that he wanted that connection to live in his children and in his grandchildren. And I can't tell you if it was the Zionist stories of our house, or our experiences at a Zionist summer camp, or the many trips to Israel, and probably it was some combination of all of those. But if we want our young people to understand why be a part of a Jewish community, why have a connection to Israel, I would argue it begins at home. Story number 2. I like to collect countries. By the time I was 36 years old, I had traveled to every continent on the planet. 3 times, I convinced my parents that I needed to go and find myself, and that they should fund it. So first I went to Europe, I wasn't there. Then I went to South America, still couldn't find myself. Finally I went to Southeast Asia, and he says, dude, if you don't find yourself there, don't come home. I found myself, and it was a great process and sort of healing and exploration, and everywhere I went, I sort of collect these Jewish stories. I found them, or in some cases they found me. I'm going to share one with you from the most unlikeliest continent, and the most difficult continent to reach, which would be, yeah, don't say Australia, Antarctica, right? And I went to Antarctica, and I know what you're all saying. You know, why on earth would that guy go to Antarctica? And there's no way he had a Jewish experience there, because not only are there no Jews there, there are no people there, and you were right on both occasions, but bear with me. So ecotourism to Antarctica is something that is quite popular and quite expensive. And as a Jewish community professional, it just wasn't within my bandwidth. But I'm what our opponents would call a very clever Jew. I have a friend who runs a company down there. Most of their clientele were Australians and Europeans. It was too far off for Canadians and Americans. Wanted to get into the Canadian market. My wife did some freelance writing. We made a shit up with the travel editor of Canada's largest daily, and she wrote a beautiful story on his program, and we got to go for free. So, the journey was almost as long as here. I flew from here down to Buenos Aires, spent 18 hours in Buenos Aires and overnight, and flew to Ushuaia, which is the southern tip of Argentina, which is, I asked someone, where does the world end? And they said, just over there. I waited another day for my boat to come in, and I sailed across Drake's Passage for 2 days, some of the roughest seas in the world, on an old Russian research vessel before I actually got to Antarctica. Now let me make 2 things perfectly clear. The ship that we were on was not Carnival Cruises. It was not Disney. Mickey wasn't running around asking me to go rock climbing with him. It was sort of an old research vessel. And Drake's Passage, I'm not much of a sailor. On the way back, we got caught in what's called a Force 12 storm. I could talk in metric here. I'm so happy to say that the waves were 25 meters high. So we were on the 6th floor of the bridge, which is higher than the ceiling, and the waves were crashing over us. For the first hour, I thought I was going to die. 6 hours afterwards, it was kind of like being on a roller coaster ride that didn't end. And when we got to the Antarctic continent, we experienced and interacted with wildlife. Amazing whales would come up to our zodiacs, giant albatrosses, elephant seals, which are enormous, and of course the darling animal of all of Antarctica, the penguin. Now I grew up watching movies like Happy Feet and Chilly Willy and understood penguins to be cute and cuddly and adorable characters until I met them. And I learned that's not exactly the case. They're actually not the cleanest animal in the world, but penguin society, interestingly enough, if you observe it, you know from 5 minutes that penguins can't possibly be Jewish. Why not? Because in penguin society there is nobody in charge. No penguin ever tells another penguin what to do. This is a very un-Jewish concept, so I established the penguins are not Jewish. On this particular day, it was a Friday. We got into the zodiac, balmy temperatures for you people that endure this hardy Melbourne winter. It was like minus 20. I put on 21 layers of clothing. The 21st was my hat. And we were going to see these chin-strap penguins, which are these traditional black and white tuxedo-looking penguins about yay big. Now, for those of you that aren't up to date on penguin anatomy and penguin life cycle events, I'll give you a very short lesson. When penguins are about 1 year old, they go through a process called molting. That is kind of like penguin puberty. Now, their voices don't change and they don't get acne, but what happens to them is all of their baby feathers go away. And it's replaced with this dark gray and black fur from their ankles all the way up their bodies to the top of their heads, coming out the side of their heads. And when you see many of these people from a distance, they look an awful lot like a group of Orthodox Jewish men, perhaps walking through the Straits of Manchuria. Now, the other thing I'll tell you about penguin anatomy is penguins, when they walk, they don't walk down the street like we do. Never saw a penguin doing that. They can't really spread their legs, so they sort of waddle, right? Now, here's a lesson in physics. If I'm standing like this, it's a lot easier to push me over than if I'm standing like this. Not that we push penguins over, but what happens when it gets really windy, they have no balance, so they blow over. They roll down the ice floe, boom, 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 into the water, where their major predator, the leopard seal, is waiting for them, and one bite. We saw it. It was like, this guy was standing there, wind came, his friends were looking around, like, where'd Ralph go? And like, oh my God, is that his foot? And we're gonna call CSI Antarctica because we witnessed a murder. So what do? To avoid this terrible fate? They all huddle together, and they find somewhere that will shield them from the wind. Oh, I don't know, maybe a big wall of rock. So there's this giant wall of rock, and there's thousands of these molting penguins, all crouched together, facing the wall, and the wind is blowing them just like this. So if you've ever been to the Kotel on one of the few times a year it snowed, and you've taken a picture, I have one, penguins, same image. That's my Jewish story. No, I'm kidding. So then we go back to the ship that day, and there's exactly 2 Jews on the ship, me and my now wife. Then she was my fiance. Excuse me for one moment. And it was interesting, as the only 2 Jews on the ship, that Friday night before Shabbos dinner, I had decided that I was going to go down onto the deck of the ship, and I was going to say the Shema. Now here's why. And my first reason wasn't to pray. That was my second. My first reason was no Orthodox Jew is coming on this trip because there's no kosher food. Most secular Jews, or Reform Jews, as I consider myself to be, don't say the Shema on Friday night with any degree of regularity. So I could be the guy in Guinness's World Book of Records who said the Shema furthest south in the world, right? And then you look up in Guinness's World Book of Records under G for guy who said Shema furthest south in the world, Michael Soberman on March the 13th, 2003. Subsequently, I learned in Australia, go figure, lit Hanukkah candles at the South Pole. You can't beat that because I'm pretty certain you can't go any further south than the South Pole. And why did I decide to say Shema? It's an interesting story. About a year before that, I decided that I wanted to become more observant. So then I decided, okay, what could I do that would make me more observant and have the least impact on my life? So I decided to start saying Shema on Monday, Thursday, and Saturday when we read Torah. Subsequently, I started saying it every day. 3 years ago, I added in the tefillin. It's a very slow progression. But interesting to note, and this is for all of you people out there that have not found your beshert. When I started saying the Shema, I was a 36-year-old bachelor, never had a girlfriend for more than 3 months. Within 3 months of saying Shema on a regular basis, I meet Rebecca, we date, get engaged, get married, and now have 2 beautiful children. So I'm just saying, for those of you that haven't found that someone yet, prayer certainly can't hurt. So here I am on the bow of the ship in this beautiful bay, the only Jewish male. And I begin, and I say, Shema Yisrael, and I stop, and I hear it being repeated back to me. Not once, but like 1,000 times. And I'm like, oh my God, these penguins are Jewish. They're one of the lost tribes. And soon someone from UIA is going to find them. They're going to bring an El Al flight down there, load it up with the penguins, bring them to Israel, settle them in Kiryat Penguin, just outside of Bat Yam. And when y'all get asked for your UIA campaign, they're going to say, for $36, you could provide integration of a penguin and language training into Israeli society. And then we'll be walking down the street. We'll say, Orthodox Jews, penguins. Orthodox Jews, penguins. And Simcha Yacobovici was going to go make a movie about the lost tribe of penguins. It wasn't so simple. There was nobody around. But there was this incredibly powerful echo. And one of the things you're supposed to do on Shabbat, of course, is appreciate the world God has created for us and the beauty of nature. I cannot think of a better place to do it. And here I was on the bow of a ship in the middle of this magnificent bay in Antarctica. The closest Jewish place of prayer was a congregation in Buenos Aires, 3,500 kilometers away from me. And you know, sometimes you can be in a room full of people and feel incredibly alone. And sometimes you can be incredibly alone and feel connected to a whole lot of people. And I will tell you, standing on the bow of the ship, reciting the Shema, and hearing it being repeated back to me over and over again in my own voice, I never felt a bigger part of a Jewish community than I did there, because that was the time when I completely understood my role as a link in a chain that began 5,000 years ago, and please God, will go at least 5,000 more. That I had the same liturgy, the same history, the same morals, the same values, and the same language as all of those Jews who made for me, and again, God willing, all of the things that I will build for those generations to come. And for me, that was the first time I said, I am part of something bigger than myself, bigger than my Toronto Jewish community or the Canadian Jewish community, but I'm part of this global Jewish community, and we are all connected. Kol Yisrael Aravim Zeh Lezeh. We're all responsible for one another. So that was really my entry point into being a valued member of this community that doesn't only exist today, but has existed since the beginning of time and hopefully until time immemorial. So the third story, I told you about my father, I told you about me. Now I have to tell you about one of my children. Don't tell my son that the story is about my daughter. So I have two amazing children, Jordan, Yardan, and Joshua. Jordan is now 13, Joshua is 8. Now when Jordan was 2.5, my wife and I decided it was enough of her sitting around the house doing nothing. And it was time that she either got a job or went to school. So we checked the labor laws in Canada. This won't come as a surprise to you. They're not dissimilar from the labor laws here. Putting a 2.5-year-old child to work, even if the wages are under the table, making small wallets, not really permissible. So we had to send her to school. Now, I am a self-confessed, not 5 minutes ago, Reformed Jew. So the most logical place for me to send my 2.5-year-old daughter for preschool would be Chabad Lubavitch, of course. So why did I send her to Chabad Lubavitch? 3 reasons. First, Chabad Lubavitch was very close to our house. Actually, Chabad Lubavitch is close to everybody's house. 2, the price was right. It was a lot cheaper than the other daycares in our neighborhood. And 3, and most importantly, they actually run a pretty good Jewish preschool. So off to Chabad my daughter goes, and every day she comes home and I ask her 3 questions. The first 3 always the same, and then a 4th question which every day changes and serves no other purpose than to amuse myself. So the first question is, Jordan, what did you do today? No, how was your day? She said, I didn't cry. Okay. And what did you do? She said, I ate a cookie. Okay. And what did you learn? She said, Daddy, I learned that Hashem, God, is everywhere. And sang this cute little song, which I won't sing for you, about God being here and there and truly everywhere. Something which, by the way, she reminds me of till today. Like when I'm driving down the street and someone cuts me off and maybe a few words come out of my mouth in the heat of the moment, this little voice says, you know, Daddy, Hashem is everywhere. He can hear you. And I'm like, thank you so much for reminding me of that. And the 4th question I asked her on this day, an important question at 2.5, was, Jordan, what do you want to be when you grow up? Because I'm told, my father asked me the same question, and my response was, I wanted to be a cowboy. And he explained to me that cowboying wasn't actually a profession. The cowboys had jobs, and they did their cowboying in the spare time. So what was my job going to be? I then allegedly told him, well, I want to work in the Jewish community, sending young people to Israel. And ta-da, here I am. So I say to this kid, Jordan, what do you want to be when you grow up? And she looks at me without even thinking, and she says, Dad, I want to be a contact lens case. That's right. My daughter aspires to be a small plastic inanimate object that one keeps their contact lenses in. And I am mortified. I call my wife from the kitchen, come. We need an intervention. We got to call the school. We got to get a psychologist. We got to get this kid in treatment. She wants to be something that I'm pretty sure you can't be paid just to be a small plastic inanimate object. And then she does something amazing. My daughter's got a good sense of humor. I look at her and I say, Jordan, and she says, no, Dad. I want to be a green contact lens case. And now I'm felling. I'm the happiest guy. All the other kids just want to be a contact lens case. My daughter knows the color. Call the wife back in and say, call Harvard. Tell them in 16.5 years this kid is going to be in the class, full scholarship. She is brilliant. Now why does my daughter want to be a green contact lens case? For those of you that have kids, you'll understand this. There is an inverse relationship between the amount of money you spend on a toy and the amount of time the child spends playing with it. So the $100 toy, they look at it once and they kick it aside. The cardboard box, best toy ever. So her favorite toy was this green contact lens case of my wife. She took it every day in the bath with her. She put it in her school bag, under her pillow at night, on the kitchen table. God forbid we should lose it. We went out the next day and bought 10 more just like it. Why does she like this green contact lens case? Simple. She loves it. It makes her happy. And it adds value to her life. What an amazing sentiment. Right? What if everybody aspired to be something that they loved, that made them happy and added value to their lives and everybody else's lives? There's a certain naivety in children that's beautiful, and then they grow up and became jaded and cynical like us. And I thought to myself, I said, that's amazing. But you know what would be more amazing? What if my daughter wanted to be Jewish for exactly the same reasons? Not because I told her to, not because of Jewish guilt, but because she saw the value in being a part of a Jewish community. It was something that she loved and something that made her happy. And in the conversation that took exactly as long as I just related to, my life's work was crystallized. This is the challenge that we have. How do we show the next generation, or this generation, why being a part of a Jewish community adds value to their life? See, because we have a really different challenge today. I would argue that anyone in this room who's under the age of 40 is part of the most privileged Jewish generation ever to live on the planet. You have total acceptance into society. You have access to any facet of society, something my parents and grandparents didn't have. You see, my parents went to the Jewish Community Center because there was nowhere else that they could go. They went to the Jewish summer camps because there was nowhere else that they could go. And guess what? They built their own hospitals and they built their own law firms because the others wouldn't let us in. We don't have to build Goldberg, Cohen, Goldberg, barristers and solicitors anymore because we're accepted into society, which is a great accomplishment. But when you're accepted into society, then the choices you make Jewishly are exactly that, choices. So how do people choose to be Jewish? And I think the answer to the question is on one hand very simple, on the other hand very complex. The answer is people choose to be Jewish if they see the value. And how do they see the value? We connect them to a story. And it's a very simple story. It's our story. 2,000 years ago, we were kicked out of our homeland, 70 AD, scattered to the four corners of the earth, right? When you're a stranger in a strange land, you have two options and two options only. One is to assimilate, when in Rome, dress like the Romans, become a Roman. Or two, be a community within a community. And if you can do that for one generation, you're great. And 2 generations, you're amazing. And 3, you're outstanding. And 4, it's unheard of. Think of anyone you know who's 2nd or 3rd generation Australian, and guess what? They're probably more Australian than they are Brazilian or Portuguese or Greek. How did we do it? Well, every time we prayed towards Jerusalem. How did we do it? We break the glass at the wedding to remember the destruction of the temple. How did we do it? At the end of the Passover Seder, we say next year in Jerusalem. An Orthodox Jew living outside of Israel never completes his or her home because it's actually only a temporary dwelling. And for 2,000 years, a Jew could only live in 2 places, right? In Israel and not in Israel. Only a Jew could answer a question when someone says, where do you live? And you tell them where you don't live. And if that's not miraculous enough, in 1870, there's a guy, in the 1860s, a guy, late 1700s, I lost my math. There's a guy, you may have heard of him, his name's Napoleon. Napoleon Bonaparte, the great emperor, passes by the Jewish synagogue on Tisha B'Av, and all the Jews' clothes are torn and they're weeping. And what does he say to them? Why are you so upset? They said, they destroyed our temple and threw us from our homes. He said, who did this? I'll make them pay. They said, you can't. He said, what do you mean I can't? I'm the greatest emperor the world has ever known. They said it happened 1,800 years ago. And as Napoleon walked away, he allegedly said to one of the people, a people who mourn the destruction of their homeland and the destruction of their temple this long will one day be reunited with their homeland. And if that's not miraculous enough, 1860, a guy comes on the scene, we've all heard of him, Theodor Herzl, right? Very secular Jew, doesn't circumcise his own child. In as late as 1890, he's answered anti-Semitism, is go to the nearest church, convert to Christianity, and they will finally accept us. 1895, he covers the Dreyfus trial. We see what happens 2 years later. He finds the world's first Zionist Congress in 1897, and here's what's amazing. In the end of his memoirs, he writes, and I quote, in Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I uttered that out loud today, it would be met with universal laughter. Perhaps in 5 years, but certainly in 50, they will know that I was right. I know it's Monday afternoon. Let's do some math. What's 1897 plus 50? 1947. November 1947, the UN votes to partition Palestine into 2 states, and 5 months later, exactly 50 years and 5 months after Herzl predicts it, the modern Jewish state becomes a reality. That story, which I just relayed to you in 2 minutes, is an incredible story, and guess what? It's not somebody else's story. It's our story, and it's their story. And if we connect them to that story, not as readers, not as people watching it on a screen, but as actors and authors, that's how we engage them in community. On day 1, I believe it was Danny and Rabbi Kennard referred to us as the people of the book, a term which incidentally has its origins in Islam. You know, in the Quran, 21 times it mentions the Jews as the people of the book. But it's okay, we'll co-opt that term, right? And we're the people of the book for all the reasons you said. But there's another reason we're the people of the book. And I believe we're the people of the book because each successive generation of Jews has the privilege and the obligation to write the next chapter of this incredible story. And that is what ownership is. We're not a community that should be completely defined by the mantra from one of my favorite films, Field of Dreams, right? If you build it, they will come. And that's how we built our communities. And while we have to continue doing that, the converse is true. If they come, they will build it. And we need to empower young people to take ownership of the community and to build communities that are relevant to them and relevant, and they see the value in being a part of it. Because we can no longer build for them. We need to build with them as partners, as authors, and as architects. So, what's the conclusion of all of this? The conclusion is twofold. If at the end of the day, my daughter really wants to be a green contact lens case, which I hope is a euphemism for an eye doctor or an optometrist, or even those Israelis who sell sunglasses in every shopping mall the world over because she'll be making an income, that's okay with me, provided, of course, she wants to be a Jewish green contact lens case. Because I am fully aware that my daughter's choice to be a part of the Jewish community will be just that, a choice. And I can help her, move her, expose her to different things so that choice will be a choice that she'll want to make by seeing the value. I suppose that I've probably left you today with more questions than answers, but after all, isn't that what good education is about? And I will say one last thing, which is this. Having spent several days in this magnificent community and the last day and a half with all of you, you can rest assured about one thing, that all of you are helping the next generation become the authors and the architects of this incredible story. And I am confident that the next chapter of this great story will not only be more rich and more vibrant than the one that came before it, but we will endow them with a sense of community slightly less broken and slightly more whole than ours. Because as a native proverb says, and think about this as you walk to lunch, we do not inherit the world from our ancestors, but rather we borrow it from our children. Thank you very much.